Well, thank you very much, Ann. It's great to be back in Phoenix. I spoke for a group of humanists in Phoenix. We were trying to figure out when it was back in the early 2000s, or was it late 90s? I think must have been. I think my hair was still short, so there. Anyway, it's always good to come to Phoenix. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. Well, I'm going to be talking about teaching evolution, and I'm hoping that there will be teachers here. But I think what I have to say is of general interest to people, because I find that many people, many citizens of our country, even those who are very interested in science, still don't actually know very much about evolution. And so hopefully what I say will be of general interest, even though my focus here and my target, if you will, is more to teachers. Now, this is being videotaped very kindly. Thank you so much, sir. So it'll be online at some point, so the 100 or 30 or so people who are here will, as is the nature of the internet, be dwarfed by the numbers of people who will actually see it online. So I will be giving some practical advice to teachers about what to teach, how to teach it, how to approach the subject, and also, which I think is indeed of general interest, what is legally possible to teach and what you legally should not do as well when it comes to the question of evolution. Now, if you ask most people to define evolution, the definition will be man evolved from monkeys. Now, unfortunately, you can hardly find 4 words that have more collective error in them. Number one, neither of these 2 primates is a monkey, for starters. And of course, what is this man stuff? Obviously, females evolved as well. It's hard enough. Parthenogenesis is not really a very useful way of getting the job done. So females also had to evolve. Second, or third maybe, humans are much more closely related to apes than they are to monkeys. And apes are not monkeys. But it's worse than that, because evolution is so much more than man evolved from monkeys. Because evolution is a general principle that cuts across all of science. The big idea of evolution is that the universe has had a history, which means that astronomy is an evolutionary science. And geology is an evolutionary science. Obviously, biology is an evolutionary science, but so is anthropology, because all of these scientific fields deal with the concept that the universe has had a history. Galaxies and solar systems and astronomical phenomena. Cosmology is an evolutionary science, as is geology, which deals largely with the evolution of the planet Earth. And obviously, cultures have cumulatively changed through time, as well as biological organisms. But I'm going to be talking today primarily about biological evolution, since that seems to be the most contentious of all the various all the various manifestations of evolution. Now, with biological evolution, what we're talking about is the idea that living things share common ancestry. When Darwin talked about evolution, he used the phrase descent with modification, which has this wonderful old 19th century ring to it. But actually, I would suggest that descent with modification is a concept that we are all very familiar with, because each of us has descended with modification from ancestors. I will give you an example. My sister Sue and I are the children of my father. Dad is the child of Grandpa. Grandpa Scott was the father of Uncle John, and Uncle John is the father of Cousin Liz. Now, Sue and I look more like each other than we look like Liz, because Sue and I shared a common ancestor in Dad more recently than we shared a common ancestor with Cousin Liz in Grandpa. The more recently you share a common ancestor, the more similar you are. That is the big idea of evolution, also of taxonomy, if you're a high school biology teacher. But it's not just that a human kinship chart, as we'd say in anthropology, or a human family tree or pedigree, if you are a person interested in heredity. It's not just that you can understand this concept by looking at a family tree. It also works for all living things. So bears and dogs look more alike because they look more like each other than they look like lions, because bears and dogs shared a common dog-like ancestor with each other more recently than they shared a common carnivore ancestor with the cats. And similarly, Cebus and howler monkeys look more like each other than they look like apes, because Cebus and howler monkeys shared a common monkey-like ancestor with each other more recently than they shared a common primate ancestor with the ape-human branch. But bears and monkeys look more like each other than they look like salamanders, because bears and monkeys shared a common mammal ancestor with each other more recently than they shared a common vertebrate ancestor with the salamanders. The more recently you shared a common ancestor, the more similar you are. This is the big idea of evolution. Unfortunately, even though what evolution is about is common ancestry, most people don't understand it this way. It's still man evolved from monkeys. And one of the things which teachers get, and I as a former college professor teaching physical anthropology, and also as somebody who spends far more time on AM talk radio than anybody really wants to, the question that I get very, very frequently on these shows is, if man evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? You know, like this is the question that's really going to stump that evolution lady. She's going, oh gosh, now what do I say? Most of the students, and actually most people in this country, think that if they think anything about evolution, monkeys evolved into apes, evolved into humans. Well, that's not actually what happened. What really happened is that apes and humans shared a common ancestor with one another more recently than they shared a common ancestor with the monkeys. And it's this branching and splitting nature of evolution that really, you know, very, very much like a family tree. This is kind of, you know, a very similar kind of process that we're looking at with evolution. Consider this in terms actually of a family tree. So you and your brother share a common ancestor in your dad. You, your brother, and your cousin share a common ancestor in your grandfather. Now think about this in terms of man evolved from monkeys, okay? Many students think that monkeys evolved into apes, evolved into humans, which is sort of like asking, if you evolved from your cousin, why is your cousin still here? The proper response, of course, is, well, I didn't evolve from my cousin. Exactly, and you also didn't evolve from a monkey. Now, many students are, even if you sort of help explain that, well, you know, we didn't evolve from monkeys, we didn't evolve from apes, we share common ancestors with apes, we share common ancestors with monkeys. Still, there are many people who, and many students, who feel kind of nervous about sharing ancestry with animals. Doesn't bother me, probably doesn't bother most of you. Actually, if you understand anything about apes particularly, chimpanzees, especially gorillas, are really nice creatures. They take very good care of their children. You know, they have a number of family values that we should perhaps become better known. But for those students or citizens, if you're dealing with the general public and you're trying to help them understand evolution, who really don't like the idea because monkeys are dirty or animals are not people, you might be able to ease them into the idea by pointing out that, well, actually, yes, human and African apes, chimps and gorillas, do share a common ancestor. But that was quite a while ago, because actually we shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals much more recently than we shared a common ancestor with the African apes. And we shared a common ancestor with Homo erectus much more recently than we shared a common ancestor with apes. And we shared a common ancestor with the Australopithecines much more recently than we shared a common ancestor with apes. We really have a lot of these more human-like forms that we have descended from. Teachers have told me that presenting evolution this way kind of helps assuage some of the concerns that some students have that we're related to those dirty monkeys that they see throwing feces in the zoo. You know, monkeys don't have all that good habits when you come right down to it. Maybe helping students understand, well, there are a lot of these intermediate common ancestors that we have might help lessen the shock a little bit. I believe in taking half steps when you can't take whole steps. I suggest that we understand evolution as a three-part idea. The big idea of evolution of common ancestry is what I've been talking about. But we also have to understand the mechanisms or processes by which bring about or effect evolution. And of course, natural selection, Darwin's most powerful idea, is extremely important in this, but there are many other mechanisms and processes of evolution that we don't have time to talk about, which are very important and very interesting, and which high school and certainly college level teachers teach. There also is the pattern of evolution. How does this wonderful tree of life branch through time? What creatures are related to what other creatures, what creatures are descended from what other creatures, and so forth and so on. So evolution is really a three-part idea. You've got the big idea, the pattern, and the process. And it's very useful to distinguish these three components of evolution if you're teaching evolution, or if you're trying to help your next-door neighbor understand evolution, because the big idea of evolution is something that's very, very well grounded in science. And many of the mechanisms and very much of the pattern of evolution is also well grounded in science. But there are many aspects of the mechanisms and very many aspects of tracing the tree of life that are still under contention. But we're not arguing over whether living things shared common ancestors. And that's a useful distinction. Let me try to explain this a little bit more clearly. It's not really a digression, but I'm going to talk for a moment about the nature of science. When you look at the content of science, the actual theories and explanations that scientists are working with, are exploring and using to explain the natural world, according to a really wonderful article by Jim Trefil, the physicist, that he published back in the 70s, A Consumer's Guide to Pseudoscience was the title. I think it came out in Harper's, really a fun article. But he had a very interesting idea there that I thought that I've used quite a bit in my own work. He mentioned that there are core ideas of science, ideas that are extremely well tested. They work, they help us understand the natural world. They work extremely well. Nobody's actually vigorously testing whether the laws of thermodynamics are true. Or whether in genetics the principle of independent assortment works. Yes, it does. These are core ideas of science. Around the core ideas of science are the frontier ideas of science. This is where the active research is taking place. If you go to ASU, you go to AU, you go to any good university, and even well-respected sectarian institutions like Brigham Young or Notre Dame, you will find research going on in evolutionary biology that's in this frontier component. Scientists still trying to make sense of the world. Some of these ideas will be found to work and they'll go into the core. Some of them won't work and they'll go into the third level, which is the fringe. And of course, there are lots and lots of fringe ideas that portray themselves as science. I suggest to people that if you go on the internet, and some of us do, that you Google free energy. Now, there are chuckles. Some of you know what I'm talking about. If you Google free energy, you will get pages of opportunities to invest in this new technology that will solve all of our problems with the coal the pollution generated by carbon, doesn't have the problems of nuclear energy. This is clean way of generating energy, and it's free. It's free energy. I mean, it basically will solve all of our problems. We don't have to build expensive solar collectors. This is a good deal. And send us your check soon. Physicists tend not to invest in these companies because if you actually look at what they're promoting, they're perpetual motion machines. They are various gizmos that violate the second and third laws of thermodynamics. There's no such thing as a free lunch, as the second law tells us. There's no such thing as free energy. So perpetual motion machines, free energies, that's out there on the fringe. The major reason why ideas are in the fringe is because they violate some core principle of science that is very well understood and is very well accepted by the scientific community. You find creation science and intelligent design in the fringe because they violate a core principle of science. What's that core principle? Common ancestry. That living things descended with modification from common ancestors. The frontier of science are the mechanisms and the patterns of evolution. That is where there still are there's still hypotheses to test and information to be generated and greater understandings to take place. I think this is a useful way of distinguishing between the two major components of evolution, shall we say, because the creationists have made a lot of strides with the general public by confusing these two areas. The creationists will say things like, oh, natural selection, a mechanism of change. Natural selectionism isn't powerful enough to build body plans like the difference between an arthropod and a vertebrate, say. So therefore, evolution didn't take place. That is a category error. That is confusing a mechanism of evolution with the big idea of evolution. Because the big idea of common ancestry really is based upon a whole different suite of observation, inferences, and theory than is natural selection. Natural selection, the reason why natural selection is a well-accepted mechanism of change, but it's based upon a different series of observations, inferences, and tested theory than is the big idea of common ancestry. We don't have time to go into the details about that, but Darwin also made this clear in The Origin of Species, where he gave the evidence for common ancestry, and he also gave the evidence for natural selection, and it's a different set of stuff. Similarly, we come to our conclusions about the pattern of evolution based upon a different set of inferences and observations than we use to discuss the mechanisms. So the big idea, the pattern and process are all different aspects of evolution. We don't argue about the whether. We debate vigorously, as is the nature of all science, about the details. And I think that's a useful thing. So let's take a look at this idea of evolution on a slightly closer level. Let's take a look at the process of evolution, the mechanisms. First of all, one thing that students don't understand and members of the general public don't really understand very well either, and that is that evolution is a populational phenomenon. There was this old legislator in Iowa who years ago, every year, bless his heart, he would submit legislation in Iowa requiring that if evolution was taught, creation science had to be taught too. I'll tell you about creation science in a little bit. But every year he'd get up in the Iowa legislature and he'd say, I have been a farmer all my life, and I have never seen a chicken turn into a cow. And he's absolutely correct. Chickens don't turn into cows. Chickens are hatched, they live and they die. Cows are born, they live and they die. I was born, I will live and I will die, so will you. We will not evolve, okay? Individuals don't evolve. Evolution is a populational phenomenon. It is something that does or does not occur to a group of organisms over time. And that seems like a simple distinction, but it's very important because there's a lot of, there's this new game, Spore, that a lot of your students will have. Spore has an individual organism that evolves. It's, they get a lot of it right, but I guess it would have been a really, really boring game if they had this population. It would have taken 4.5 billion years to evolve. So, kids aren't going to play it. So what can I say? So we have a group of organisms, a group of rabbits or a group of pine trees, or a group of people, a group of something. And if we look carefully at this population of organisms, we will see that at any given point of time that there are variants. So not all the rabbits look alike. There's variation in this population. Some of the rabbits have longer ears, some shorter ears, some have thicker coats, thinner coats. There are various biochemical differences among these, one rabbit to another. There's variation. This is something that's been noticed by everybody who takes a look at more than one members of a species. Now, unlike Darwin, we have a very good idea now in the 20th and 21st century as to where that variation in a population comes from. And primarily it comes from a series of genetic mechanisms, recombination, mutation, non-random mating, etc., which are generally studied to some degree in high school, definitely are studied in college biology. And these mechanisms, every generation, create variation in any population of organisms. But populations don't live in a vacuum. Populations of organisms live in environments. And environments have challenges. There are problems of heat or cold, or if it's an aquatic organism, of pressure from depth, shallow versus deep, as well as heat and cold. For many organisms, there's a problem of finding mates, for all of us, finding nesting sites, perhaps, being able to keep from being some creature's prey, being able to find food. So there's lots of challenges that any organism has in an environment. And these challenges act upon the variation in the population, in the sense, and this is the basic idea of natural selection, in the sense that some of those rabbits in this population, shall we say, just happen to have the genetic variation that allows them to live longer and have more offspring than other rabbits in that particular environment. So if the environment's getting colder, then those rabbits that just happen to have thicker coats are more likely to survive and pass on copies of their genes, shall we say. If the environment is getting warmer, well, maybe those rabbits that have longer ears for radiation of heat, like your rabbits here in Arizona, those are going to be the rabbits that are more likely to survive. It all depends on the environment. It all depends on the kind of variation that the species exhibits. But every generation, you get variation coming into the population. Every generation, some of those variants are better off in that particular environment than others. What happens over a period of time? Well, what happens is change. Some of those variants survive longer, leave offspring, leave more copies of their genes. The population can gradually change through time if this process goes on generation after generation. And that's the basic idea of natural selection and adaptation. Adaptation is a very important component of evolution, but it's not the whole story. In order to get, shall we say, a new species, what you need is something called speciation. Species have to change from one species to another. There's two general ways that this takes place. Let's say we have a population, we'll call it A, and it's living at one period of time. And at a later time, we come back and we see that there have been some changes in this population. Maybe the rabbits have got longer ears now because the climate's getting warmer. And maybe we come back at a later time because we have a time machine and we can do this, and we find that there's yet more changes. And if we come back through a period of time considerably later, we may find that there have been so many changes that we really think that there's enough change that we'll refer to this as a new species. So we'll call it B instead of A. That is one way that speciation can take place. It's probably not the most common way that speciation takes place, but in some limited varieties, and possibly in the later stages of human evolution, this is how many species change. The more common way that species change is when a lineage splits. And let's say that one of these A prime population gets separated from the mothership, so to speak. And it no longer, members of this population can no longer find mates with the original. There's a geographical barrier, shall we say, that splits off these two populations. Now, over a period of time, it's quite possible that what geneticists refer to as isolating mechanisms may affect these populations as it's changing through time. Now, some of these isolating mechanisms refer to a whole suite of things that can operate on a population that can change it so much that it is sufficiently different from its mother population, shall we say, that it can no longer exchange genes. Some of these are things like maybe breeding at a different season of the year. If the mother population, the A prime population on the left, tends to breed in the fall, but this new breakaway population, for various reasons in its environment, is breeding in the spring, well, then the chances are you're not going to exchange genes should specimens from one to the other come back into contact again. This has happened with a number of fruit fly populations, for example, and some other insects. But whatever the isolating mechanisms are, whether they're genetic or whether they're behavioral, after a period of time, you might get a new population that evolves over time and is no longer able to exchange genes. This is probably the case with our own species. We have considerable branching around 2 to 3 million years ago as ground-dwelling bipedal hominines branched into a variety of adaptations. They're the Australopithecine groups, Paranthropus habilis, Paranthropus ergaster. A lot of the Australopithecines aren't listed there. The whole bunch of these little varmints, which sort of show up at all at around the same, 1.5 million year period. But out of this, as you see there on the top, comes one lineage, Homo, which gave rise to, it says ergaster here, but it's Homo erectus, whatever, evolving into our own species. So we have a little bit of both. The evolution of the horse is not a single species gradually changing through time, but as you can see with the diagram on the right, repeated branching and splitting of lineages, and then eventually one genus, Equus, which is the modern day horses and zebras and donkeys, which comes out at the end. Because virtually all horses on the planet today are domesticated, their evolution has been taken over by humans, so they're not always the best example, but we can use them as an example of something else. Sometimes speciation isn't complete, and at the early stages of speciation, genes can sometimes be exchanged. For example, the ancestors of the now domesticated horses and donkeys occupied similar niches, but in somewhat different environments. Horse fossils are found in plains areas, and tooth morphology indicates they're grazers. Donkey fossils are found in foothills or uplands, and they're also grazers. Well, horses and donkeys can still interbreed, and of course, the product is mules. But horses and donkeys are partially speciated because mules are not fertile. So the original, probably back in the late Miocene or Pliocene, when horses and donkeys became geographically sort of separated, they have begun to diverge, but they are not completely speciated yet. Unfortunately, horses and donkeys are both domesticated, so their genetics get more complicated. But really, the same thing happened with the big cats. If you look at lions and tigers, they occupy a very similar niche. They're large-bodied, stalking cats that go after large prey. Cats and dogs both kind of diversify in terms of stalking versus running, large prey, medium prey, small prey. Lions and tigers are big guys. And they occupy very similar niches, one in Africa, one in Asia. Probably lions and tigers evolved from a common ancestor that originally inhabited the available territory across a wide range of Africa and Asia. Climate changes and continental movements reduced the ability of African and Asian populations to exchange genes, and African lions and Asian tigers began to diverge. Now, today we consider African lions and Asian tigers as separate species because they don't exchange genes in the wild. But in zoos, you can get ligers and tigons, which are crosses between, in the case of a tigon, a tiger father and a lion mother, and ligers are lion fathers and tiger mothers, and ligers can get really, really big. There's some, if you, just for fun, go ahead and Google liger, and you'll get all sorts of pictures. These things are like this high. I mean, they're quite amazing animals. But this is an unnatural, if you will, species, because this doesn't happen in the wild. But it shows that lions and tigers are incompletely speciated, much like donkeys and horses. So the process of adaptation and speciation are very important to understanding evolution in terms of the mechanics. But let's move away from the science of evolution right now and talk about some of the controversial issues, shall we say. Yeah, evolution is well accepted in the scientific community, but the fact that it's socially controversial may cause problems for teachers. In this cartoon, Curtis is saying, "Teacher, the Board of Ed wants us to think man evolved from monkeys. The Bible says man was poof, created in his image. How do we answer question 19? How did man originate?" Mrs. Nelson, I don't think you're supposed to take that many aspirin. So what can we tell a teacher to encourage him or her to do the professionally responsible thing, which obviously is to teach standard science, teach evolution, when there are lots of community pressures in many districts, many states, to just skip evolution and make things a great deal easier. In my experience, the anxieties that teachers have about teaching evolution can be grouped into three categories: those having to do with religion, those having to do with the content of the science of evolution, and those having to do with legal issues. Let's talk about the religious component first. Now, anti-evolutionists present creation and evolution as a dichotomous choice. You are either a good guy Christian creationist or you're a bad guy atheist evolutionist. And clearly, just, what can you say, empirically, it is the case that this is just wrong. On the NCSE website, which is ncsc.com, if you go to /evolution, you will find information on the creation and evolution continuum, which is a much more accurate way of representing the relationship from a religious standpoint between creation at one end and evolution at the other. Now, we don't have time to go into it, but this is a fun lecture to give, and teachers, professors, there's information on our website about this continuum and how to teach it. But basically, the most extreme creationists are flat earthers, the next most extreme are geocentrists, the next most extreme are young earth creationists, about whom I'll talk in a moment, and old earth creationists are somewhat less extreme in that they at least accept the age of the earth. Theistic evolutionists, which is a big surprise to most people, it's the mainstream Protestant and Catholic position that evolution occurred and it was part of God's plan, and then materialists, which is what I am, at the bottom of this continuum. The point being that it is not a dichotomy. There are many Christian positions regarding creation and evolution, some of which are compatible with evolution, with acceptance of evolution. Our book, Voices for Evolution, presents a number of statements from religious organizations that help to illustrate the fact that, again, Catholics and mainstream Protestants accept evolution as how God did it. Now, it is absolutely true that some interpretations of creation, some interpretations of Christianity are simply incompatible with evolution. No question about that. If you are a biblical literalist, evolution doesn't work for you. The important thing to realize is that not all Christians are biblical literalists, that there's a lot of variety out there. And frankly, at NCSE, some of my best allies are members of the mainstream clergy who don't want to see biblical literalism taught in science class, because that's not their theology. The fact that there is diversity within the Christian community is something that many students do not understand. And it is a useful thing to just help to illustrate the fact that it is not a dichotomy. The science building of a large Midwestern university has this quote in the floor in a big tile, and I hope you can read it across the top. It says, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution," and it quotes a very important geneticist named Theodosius Dobzhansky. This was from an article that he wrote in the American Biology Teacher in 1972. And it's a very strong statement, obviously, about the importance of evolution to biology. The biology department in this university was given one tile. And the geologist had another one, and the chemist had another one. The biologist chose to make their tile, and this thing is this far across. I had a tough time photographing it because I couldn't get the angle. This is a very large thing, and the biology department felt that Dobzhansky's quote, "and evolution was so important to biology," that that is what they wanted on their tile. This is Notre Dame. I'll give you this graphic if you need it. Now, many teachers don't feel confident. Let's talk about the content of evolution, because that is another problem. Many teachers don't feel confident to teach evolution because they don't understand the subject matter well enough. Now, I blame the universities for this. If a high school teacher, middle school teacher doesn't understand evolution well enough, doesn't understand the nature of science well enough to do a good job teaching it, it's the fault of the science departments because they're not spending enough time properly teaching these topics. But things are improving as I travel around and I do a lot of speaking at universities. I find that there's a lot more attention being paid to, gee, we've got to teach this stuff better. What's the best way to do it so that students really understand this material? Some of those undergraduate students will become teachers, and that's very important for us to realize. But meanwhile, There are some very good resources, some of them online, such as the Understanding Evolution site, which is produced by the University of California, Berkeley Museum of Paleontology. That's evolution.berkeley.edu, an excellent source for all kinds of information. They also have the Understanding Science site, which is all in the nature of science, which is also superior. The NOVA Evolution program, I was talking to David earlier. He also worked with the NOVA Evolution program of 2001. Excellent materials, a good deal of online materials that supplement the 7 hour-long programs that are available for free as well. There are many, many books and magazines where you can get a lot of understanding about the science of evolution, many of them very easily accessible to teachers and the general public. I do encourage you strongly to avail yourself. This last one, The Tangled Bank by Carl Zimmer, is particularly good. Now let's move on to the legal aspects because teachers may be very anxious about what they can and cannot teach. Now the First Amendment is the controlling legal concern here. Let me just illustrate for you the religion clause of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The establishment and free exercise clauses taken together, and they're a package deal, mean that public institutions have to be religiously neutral. That means they can neither promote nor attack religion. That's what neutrality is all about. I will come back to this in just a moment. Let's talk about what teachers can do. Well, obviously they can teach evolution and should. There is no law anywhere in this country that bans the teaching of evolution. In fact, there's a Supreme Court case that says you can't ban the teaching of evolution. So you can teach evolution, you should teach evolution. It is in your state science standards and in the science standards of almost every other state. You can teach about religion, okay? You can describe religious views. It's okay to let students know about the continuum of views about creation and evolution that I showed you a little while ago. It's okay to students descriptively to show them that there are a variety of opinions about creationism and evolution. You just can't recommend any particular position on the continuum. That would violate the First Amendment. And let me be just really, really, really clear about this. You cannot advocate for or against religion. You can't say Mohammed was right, nor can you say Jesus was right. Although you can describe Islam, you can describe humanism, you can describe Christianity or any other religion or ideological view. You just cannot advocate for or against religion. That is what the First Amendment Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clauses mean when you read them together. Now, let's go on to what can't you do. What have the courts said? Well, for starters, your district or your school or your state cannot ban the teaching of evolution, and you can't require equal time for creationism. Now let me just talk just quickly about that. The most important anti-evolution movement is creation science, which was begun by this man on the right, Henry Morris. It began in the early 1960s. It's still going strong. Creation science is the idea that not just the biblical literalist account of creation is true, which they believe from a religious standpoint, but the claim is that you can demonstrate it scientifically, which is why they call it creation science. Henry Morris says in this book, Creation Science, the purpose of scientific creationism, is to treat all of the more pertinent aspects of the subject of origins and to do this solely on a scientific basis with no references to Bible or to religious doctrine. Nobody here but us scientists, right? However, in execution, this doesn't always work out that way. The claims do not match reality. As Morris has said, the Word of God must take first priority and secondly, the observed facts of science. So they start off with their conclusion and they look through the scientific evidence and pull out those things that they think are likely to support their point of view. It's not how we do science, folks. The science of creation science is awful, and if you want to talk about that, that's fun to do. But I obviously don't have time to do that today. But one of the zanier components of creation science is something called flood geology. As Anne remarked, you can explain Grand Canyon as being the result of Noah's flood. If you want to know more about why Grand Canyon is not catastrophically deposited nor cut, NCSC has a raft trip down Grand Canyon every year in which I will provide you the creationist point of view, and we have a geologist to provide the straight science, and you can decide for yourself. Here we're looking at a sandstone slab that's called the Coconino sandstone that young earth creationists claim has, this is true, there are footprints of small quadrupeds that are going over this, probably early amphibians, maybe early reptiles, depending on exactly where you are. And indeed, there are footprints of small creatures. The creationists interpret this as these creatures were running away from the rising floodwater. Of course, why these footprints didn't get wiped out by the rising floodwater is a little curious, and why a wind lane or aeolian deposit that's probably at least 500 or 1,000 feet thick occurs in the middle of all these water lane deposits is curious from a geological standpoint. But that's the kind of stuff we talk about. It's a very fun trip. It's a very fun trip. Creation science is based on a Christian perspective called special creationism, which focuses on the idea that God created everything in its present form. And when it comes to biological organisms, created kinds with limited genetic variation. There's basically two general kinds of creation science. There's the young earth creationism and the old earth creationism. Young earthers obviously think the earth is only thousands of years old. Old earthers at least accept that the earth is hundreds of millions or billions of years old. But old earthers still choke on biology. They still believe that evolution didn't take place, that God just specially created things over and over and over as you go through the geological column. Now, intelligent design kind of overlaps both of these in many respects. Intelligent design includes people from both camps. We don't have time to go into what intelligent design is and how it really is just a small subsection of these, but that's sort of the general playing field there. If you read the creation science literature, especially the young earth literature, you will find over and over what they call the two-model approach, in which, again, this dichotomous view that there's either creation or evolution. If you disprove evolution, what's left? And this is exactly what the literature consists of. Attacks upon evolution, why evolution couldn't possibly have occurred. Again, they have their creationist point of view, and they go through the scientific literature and they try to pull out those little pieces that seem to challenge evolution. So disproving evolution is really what creationism is all about. Evidence against evolution is key to understanding creationism. Keep that phrase in mind because it's going to come back. Of course, there's a logical problem here, naturally, because disproving evolution doesn't prove special creationism, because there's a whole lot of other possibilities over there on that left-hand side. Theistic evolution, for example, the position of Catholics and mainstream Protestants. But there's also world religions that are not Christian or Middle Eastern monotheisms. There are ancient religions that are no longer around. These are no longer, these are not proven by the disproof of evolution any more than special creationism is. And of course, there are many, many tribal religions which also are not proven true if you disprove evolution. So the whole logic here falls pretty quickly. But it is a very popular approach. Well, what can't you do? Not only can you not teach creationism, not only can your state or district not pass a law saying you have to teach creationism, the Supreme Court has spoken, you also, as a teacher, cannot teach creationism freelance, so to speak. You cannot just go ahead and teach this on your own. This was tested by a series of 3 cases during the 90s and the early 2000s, where teachers in all 3 cases were teaching creationism, were teaching evidence against evolution. Their district said, no, don't do that. We don't want you to teach that. That's not part of the curriculum. And in each of these 3 cases, the teachers sued their districts for their right to teach what they thought were good science. In all three cases, the court said, no, you have to do what your district tells you to do. Basically, a K-12 teacher, a kindergarten through 12th grade teacher, does not have the academic freedom that you find at the college level. If you as a teacher sign a contract with a district, you have agreed to teach that district's curriculum. That's not a bad thing, because the district society has an interest in having some continuity from classroom to classroom. So that's why you have a district curriculum. That's why you require teachers to actually teach it. So the lack of academic freedom at the K-12 level is not a terrible thing that we should lament. Okay, what else can you not do? Well, you can't teach intelligent design. Kitzmiller versus Dover was a district court case, not a Supreme Court case, in which intelligent design was ruled not science, and therefore it was definitely, since it was religion and not science, there was no secular reason to teach it, so the only reason for teaching it was religious, and you can't do that. So intelligent design was struck down at this federal district court level. This was a very strong opinion. Many of you, just for fun, how many of you have read Kitzmiller versus Dover? Yeah, my kind of people. Lots of hands went up. It is such a strong opinion that I think all but the most fanatic districts would be discouraged from trying to pass Dover-type resolutions, because they know that they would be hit by exactly the same arguments and they would lose, and it's very expensive to lose. Okay, what else can you not do? I have a little asterisk here. You cannot teach evidence against evolution. There have been some court decisions that have talked about this, including Kitzmiller, but there has not been a really clean test of this idea of teaching evidence against evolution. Now, the evidence against evolution strategy comes from a dissent to the Supreme Court decision, Edwards versus Aguilar, that struck down equal time for creation science. Justice Scalia wrote in his dissent that the people of Louisiana, there was this little murmur through the audience as Scalia's face went on the, that's a very flattering picture of it. I got the most flattering picture of him I could get. Surely, the people of Louisiana are entitled to have whatever scientific evidence there may be against evolution presented in their schools. Now, this was a dissent. It does not have the force of a legal interpretation, but creationists have seized upon this with great enthusiasm and have encouraged teachers to teach the evidence against evolution, even if they can't teach creationism. Shortly after Edwards came down, and I apologize for presenting lots of script on a slide because it's mean to make people read, but school boards and teachers should be encouraged to stress the scientific evidences and arguments against evolution in their classes. Not just arguments against some proposed evolutionary mechanism, but against evolution per se. That's common ancestry, right? The big idea. And this is good. Even if they don't wish to recognize these as evidences and arguments for evolution, for creation. Okay, where have we seen this before? Right, evidence against evolution is evidence for creationism. So the dissent from Scalia has become the core legal principle, shall we say, that creationists use to argue, to pass these various and sundry academic freedom laws and so forth that we're finding today. One of the first examples of this was in Ohio in 2002, when the state science education standards passed with this standard, number 23, describe how scientists continue to investigate and critically analyze aspects of evolutionary theory. May I translate for you? Critically analyze doesn't mean critically analyze. Critically analyze means criticize, okay? I say this because of the intent and the statements of the school board members who put this in. Their purpose was to get something on the books that would encourage teachers to attack evolution, to bring in the evidence against evolution. As Philip Johnson, who is one of the theoreticians of the intelligent design movement, wrote, the recent decision of the Ohio Science Standards Committee of the State Board of Education has been a big breakthrough. Critics are calling it a compromise, but it isn't. It's our position. It allows teachers to present evidence against the theory of evolution. Recently, in the last 5 years or so, we have had approximately 40 academic freedom laws proposed in state legislatures around the country. If you go to ncsc.com, you'll get a lot more information about this. And this is only a partial list. I don't have room on one slide for all of the laws. And you'll notice some states that you wouldn't normally associate with the Bible Belt, like Michigan and Iowa and New Mexico and Maryland. But these bills have been popping up all over the country. Now, in all but one of these bills, local citizens like you, working with us and working with other allies on the ground, have gone to state legislatures, have called up their legislator, have called up the chair of the education committee, which is where these bills usually show up, and said, we don't want this bill passed. Here's why it's bad science. Here's why it's bad for the education of the kids in our state. And the reason why these bills don't get out of committee is because citizens have taken a stand at this. And yes, we can help them, but nobody's going to listen to NCSE. If I call up the Maryland legislature and say, we don't think you should have this bill, they say, who are you? You're from California. But if somebody from his district calls up and says, we don't want this bill, that's where things happen. So all politics is local, and this kind of politics is really local. So because good citizens have stood up for good science education, none of these bills, except for one, has passed. And that's the Louisiana Science Education Act, and it is worded in a very slippery fashion. The slippery wording of these bills is very important because they don't necessarily sound like they're anti-evolution. Critically analyze evidence for evolution, like in the Ohio standards. Oh, well, we critically analyze stuff all the time in science. What's wrong with that? Why is just evolution picked out? That's one of the signs. Present the evidence for and evidence against evolution. That's another phrase, came from Texas. Strengths and weaknesses of evolution, another Texas favorite. Present evolution as theory, not fact. Well, I'm all for that. Because after all, theories explain facts. Theories are more powerful than facts. That's not exactly what's meant by these theory, not fact proposals. They're using theory like we use the word on the street, not as we use it in science. In science, a theory is an inferential explanation. It's the most powerful thing we've got. It's the most important thing in science, our explanations. Theory in this context of theory, not fact, evolution is merely theory, means it's just a hunch or a guess. It's not something like a fact, which is really important. So this is an anti-evolution bill. This is an anti-evolution approach. So there's a lot of these euphemisms, shall we say, that are out there. The Academic Freedom Acts, the evidence against evolution approach, avoid mentioning religion, which of course is why, because they're trying to avoid the Establishment Clause, which has nailed them every single time they've mentioned the C word. Anytime they've mentioned creationism, creation science, intelligent design, so who's the designer? I mean, anytime they've dealt with issues that sound more religious, they've lost, so these bills are scrupulously clean about not mentioning creation or religion. They stress free speech. They stress the academic freedom of teachers, the academic freedom of students to learn, to decide what's true. We want 7th graders deciding what's true? Come on, give me a... No, honey. Hydrogen and oxygen make up water. You can't just have them in any proportions you want. It can't be H3O. No, that's not hydrogen. That's not water. You have to have H2O. No, some things you don't decide what's true. You do take the received wisdom of science. 2 + 2 really equals 4. These bills often tend to be protective in the sense that, unlike those 3 cases I mentioned before where teachers freelanced the teaching of creationism and were nailed by their districts, most of these bills would protect teachers from districts or other superintendents, principals, any administrator that tried to make them stop teaching the evidence against evolution, although they phrase it more, strengths and weaknesses of evolution, or using these various euphemisms. The idea being that you will sort of put a muzzle on the First Amendment. These bills have not been tested in court, so we're not sure how they will fare. One very clever strategy of these academic freedom acts is that they are permissive. They're permissive in the sense that, unlike the Dover policy, which said teachers will do A, B, and C, these say teachers can do A, B, and C. From a legal standpoint, there's a big difference, because if you have a bill that requires somebody to do something, then you can go to a judge and say, Judge, we believe that this bill is going to cause harm. We want to bring suit, and the judge will say, fine, go for it. If you bring a permissive bill to a judge and say, Judge, we think this bill is going to do harm, and the judge will say, well, it just says teachers can do this. We don't know that they're going to. Let's just wait and see how this plays out. So what you have to do, if it's a permissive bill, you've got to actually find the teacher who's stepping over the line. And then you've got to, within that teacher's class, find somebody with standing to sue. And then you can bring your case. That's very hard. That really raises the barrier for challenging these cases. If it's an as-applied case, which is what the legal term for these kinds of cases are, as opposed to a facial challenge to the wording of the bill on its face. So these bills are very cleverly written. And many of them avoid singling out evolution because, of course, there is a Supreme Court case that says you can't single out evolution for special treatment. That's ipso facto evidence that you have a religious purpose. Instead, they bundle evolution with global warming or stem cells or origin of stem cells. They don't teach stem cells in high school. What is this? They don't teach human cloning in high school. This is ridiculous. But evolution, origin of life, stem cells, climate change, these things are often bundled, not because they're particularly important to the science curriculum, although evolution is, but because these are the religious conservatives' bugaboos of the moment. And these are the issues that they're concerned about and that they want teachers to attack. And these bills have been very common. We're about to get another one passed, unfortunately, in the state of Tennessee. And if you go to ncseweb.com, you can find out more about what's going on here. So, schematically, what have we done? Creation science begat intelligent design. Intelligent design, after the Edwards versus Aguilar decision, striking down creation science and the ID folks morphed into the argument that we should present evidence against evolution, or alternatively, we should present alternate theories to evolution. These are basically the same kind of thing. Well, now as a scientist, I really don't know any alternate theories to explaining the diversity of living things. It's common ancestry. That is the only scientific theory. So if you go to a scientist and you say, give me the alternative theories to evolution, please, they'll just give you kind of a quizzical look because they don't know what you're talking about. If you go to the proponents of teaching alternative theories, you'll find that they are proposing exactly what used to be called intelligent design and creation science. Similarly, if you go to the professors in science at ASU and say, could you please give me a list of the evidence against evolution? I need to teach this. They won't know what you're talking about. There is no evidence against evolution. There is no evidence against the idea that living things shared common ancestry. All of the evidence that we have, from biogeography, from comparative anatomy, from genetics, from the fossil record, from any number of different sources, that all is very compatible in pointing very clearly to the inference that living things had common ancestors. Nothing out there is running a big neon light saying, whoa, evolution fails here, we have to toss it out. But if you ask the proponents of the teaching of evidence against evolution, the proponents of these academic freedom acts, where's the list of stuff we can teach? Well, miraculously enough, you are led right back to intelligent design and creation science. So really what we're dealing with is the effort to bring creationism back into the curriculum without calling it creationism, just changing its name, just leaving the content without the title. And it's surprisingly successful. When we look at the modern creationist movement, we see the same arguments, but at different times in the history of this controversy, different arguments have been emphasized, but all have been part of the mix at any given time. The first pillar of creationism, as we call them at NCSE, is that evolution is weak science. Scientists are giving up on evolution. Evolution is weak scientific theory. The second one, of course, is the alleged incompatibility of of religion and evolution. And the third argument is the fairness argument that, well, if you teach evolution, it's only fair to teach creationism or some other derivative. Creationism, intelligent design, evidence against evolution. Today, the first and the third pillars are the strongest, and it's this very interesting combination of fairness and the alleged weaknesses of evolution that we're finding in the current legislation. Well, how can we refute the pillars of creationism? Well, yeah, present that evolution is indeed sound science, and it is. And we have lots of support for that from scientists, from teachers, and from the mainstream religious community. We need to encourage the idea that religion and evolution are not incompatible. Notice how carefully I stated that. Some religious views are incompatible with evolution. No question about it. Not all are. And the ones that aren't are not the opponents of the teaching of evolution. And it's very important to deal with the fairness argument. It isn't fair to miseducate students. And leaving evolution out undereducates students. Teaching evidence against evolution, alternative theories to evolution, miseducates students. It is not fair to handicap our students in terms of their ability to become scientifically literate citizens, and for many of them to go on to a scientific career. So my suggestions to teachers or anybody who is coping with anti-evolutionism: you need to learn and teach accurately about evolution. You need to learn and teach accurately about the nature of science. It's very important to defuse the religion issue, because that is still a large part of why many people don't want to have evolution taught in the schools. And you need to defuse the equal time/fairness issue, which, interestingly enough, is the strongest argument they have, not because it's valid, but because it taps into American principles of fairness and free speech and academic freedom and all of these very good cultural values, which really don't apply to science so much, you know? Science is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of finding out how the world works, testing those explanations, and tentatively hanging on to the ones that work best, and getting rid of the ones that don't. At ncse.com, our website, you can find a lot more about this controversy. I encourage you to go to this button here where it says News Alerts. We have a free Friday newsletter. How many of you get Glenn Branch's newsletter? Yeah, quite a few of you. Thank you. Hope you are also members. You don't have to be a member to get this very, very useful newsletter. If you go to the News button up here, you'll be taken to a page where you can sort either by state or by year and find out a great deal about what's going on in the creationism and evolution controversy. We are a membership organization, and I thank Anne for encouraging you to join. I encourage you to join as well. And don't forget, we've got this cool Grand Canyon trip too. You might like to go along on that. My colleagues at the National Center for Science Education are my Deputy Director, Glenn Branch, who puts out that wonderful newsletter on Fridays. Robert Lunn is our Communications Director. Peter Hess is our Faith Community Outreach Director. And my flare-ups wranglers, Josh Rosenow and Steve Newton, are the ones who are primarily responsible for handling we all actually end up helping those teachers and school boards and legislatures that need help on this controversy, but especially Josh and Steve. And Eric Mickle is our education outreach person. Like all good nonprofits, we are on Facebook and we are on YouTube, so you can join us there and get our updates. The YouTube clip there is a picture of Steve Gould, whom many of you know, of course, is a foremost popularizer and educator of the public on evolution and science. He's holding what is the world's best bumper sticker that we put out, and it's honk if you understand punctuated equilibrium. Which creates great hilarity in biological circles. And you don't get many honks, okay? No. Just deal with it. Many is the time that I have been moving onto the freeway and somebody behind me leans really hard on his horn, and I just assume they understand punctuated equilibrium and just drive along. It helps to cultivate that peace that passeth understanding, you know. But when you do get a honk, you know, you hear this little beep beep, and you're at a stoplight, and you think, why is this jerk honking at me? The light's red, and then you look in the rearview mirror, and they're going. So it's a great bumper sticker. And I am on Facebook as well. If you go to facebook.com/eugenie.scott, like me, and you will get my my updates as well. This has been so much fun being able to come and spend an afternoon with you guys. This is really, you know, there's so many organizations here. I've met a number of you in the question, or as we were milling around before the talk. And I'm very privileged to have been asked to be your kickoff speaker on what I hope will be an annual event. And I wish you great luck in your efforts to support science education. And thank you for concentrating on teachers. They need your help, they need your support, and they need to know that you're there as members of the voting public when those school boards start to make wrong decisions. Thank you very much for inviting me. I haven't gone away. Can you speak very loudly, please?
I have a question for the audience. How many people here are actually educators?
Thank you. Thank you for being a teacher. The question was, how many of you in the audience are educators, are teachers? And there were a number of hands that went up. Can we have a round of applause for the teachers in the audience, please? We owe you a lot. You have a tough job. There. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess there's somebody wandering around with a microphone that I should be paying.
What's the latest DNA evidence on the relationship between Neanderthal and
Did you hear? The question was, I've got the best mic here, don't I? The question was, what is the latest DNA evidence on the relationship between Neanderthal and modern humans? The latest DNA evidence shows that the split between modern humans and Neanderthals was pretty long ago, you know, like at least 150,000 years, if not more. But you know, when I was talking about donkeys and horses, and I was talking about lions and tigers, and I mentioned that at the beginning of speciation, the speciation isn't poof, you know, all of a sudden you can't interbreed. There's a fairly long period in which it's possible for you to have, or for populations to have some gene flow. And this appears to be the case in terms of the split between Neanderthals and modern humans. Because modern humans do Europeans and Africans, is it? Or Europeans and Asians? Europeans and Asians contain 5% plus or minus genes shared with Neanderthals, which I knew already. In fact, I think it's even more genes than that, frankly. I mean, you know, well, I'm a physical anthropologist, so I can go on and on and on about Neanderthals and humans and all that, but I won't. I'll be a good person. Yes? Huh? Oh, yeah, thank you. This month's Discover magazine apparently has an article, this month being April of 2011, because this is going to go on the internet, and you know, somebody's going to be listening to this tape 2 or 3 years from now, and they're going to be going to the, you know, like the August 2014 Discover and say, what, that guy didn't know what he was talking about. Okay, the April 2011 Discover magazine discusses this. Okay. So man with a microphone, go for it.
Yes. Dr. Scott, I was just wondering, something so simple that we are nothing but evolved into.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Oh.
There, that's better.
I'm sorry. Something that everybody seems to miss. We are evolved, mutated primates that create bizarre, magical beings of imaginary friends with our brains. Why everybody sees that? We are created by cultures. We are not created by stork. So nobody seems to see this. When you believe, bizarre mathematical beliefs, accept it as reality. And you can, talk to Dr. Sapolsky or Robert Chandler, are product of malfunctioning brains. So, and nobody mentions it. We have 6 members of the Supreme Court of the United States. They are infected with psychosis. In other words, Justice Roberts, this man is in the Supreme Court.
I think there's a question in here somewhere.
He believes in a resurrecting zombie that saves with blood. Why are these people not put in mental institutions? Define religious belief as a mental and neurological disorder, as it is, just like a schizophrenia. Why don't do that? That will solve the problem. Thank you.
Freedom of religion works both ways.
Yep, that's absolutely true. That was a rhetorical question. I don't think that you really expected an answer. But, as an anthropologist, I look at religion a little differently. The idea that there is, of course, this material universe, the matter and energy, I think, therefore I am. I don't know about you, but we all live in a material universe. Every human being on the planet realizes that. Most human cultures also believe that, in fact, all of them, everyone known to anthropologists, also believe that there is a non-material reality of some sort, which is other than the world in which we live. This is a belief that's very easy to learn, and because it's present in every human society. Now, this non-material reality, which is the only term that's general enough to describe it for all human beings, all human cultures, can take many, many forms. The one in the United States that we're most familiar with is the Middle Eastern monotheistic version of, heaven and hell and angels and, demons and whatever the other stuff people believe in. But, you're here in Arizona. The Hopi have the Sipapu, which is what geologists would call a karst formation up the Little Colorado River. And traditional Hopi will tell you that their ancestors came out of the Sipapu, which is a very impressive structure, by the way. They came out of from lands below the earth, and there's generations of these sorts of things, and you've got various members of the spirit world and so forth and so on. That also is a non-material reality, just like the Christian and Jewish and Muslim version of heaven and hell and so forth. You can go around the planet, and every single human culture that's been studied by anthropologists has some version of that. I think the question is, if you really want to understand religion, you have to understand, why is this such an easy behavior to learn? You don't find universals, anthropologists will tell you, you don't find cultural universals unless there's some sort of adaptive value. Adaptive value doesn't necessarily mean truth. I am a materialist myself in my personal philosophy. I don't believe there is a non-material universe of any kind. I don't think the Hopi are right. I don't think Christians are right, or any other group who believes in something other than the material world. I'm a materialist. I think the material world is all there is. That's my personal philosophy. But I am the oddball. Most human beings find it very, very easy to learn and live in a world in which there's both a material and a non-material reality, and to have a whole set of behaviors and rituals and beliefs that allow people to interact with that non-material reality, just like the Hopi interact with their spirits. So, you know, there's quite a literature out there proposing why this is such an adaptive behavior. One that I'll just throw out for you to think about, because I think it's a very powerful one, is that it increases the us-them distinction. We do this, we have this set of rituals that links us to our gods. They have their set of beliefs and rituals that link them to their God, and we can tell us from them because they do things differently regarding this very important practice of sort of keeping the sun rotating or actually world's flat in most cases. You know, keeping the world, you know, keeping the seasons coming. You know, that's a regularity. So the us-them distinction has biological consequences as well, because it sort of increases the amount of intra-group mating, although still allowing some extra-group mating, so you get faster evolution that way. I mean, I don't know, maybe the adaptive value of religion is just increasing the us-them, which has genetic consequences. It's an interesting speculation. There are many, many other speculations that you can read about. But I don't believe that, as our questioner or stater, I don't believe that religion is a mental abnormality. Either that or all human beings are nuts. And I don't think so, because we wouldn't have as successful an adaptation as we have if we were all crazy. Okay, man with the microphone, I can't see you, but I'm sure you've got somebody else to talk to.
Short of being an atheist, I understand somehow that you're
Put the microphone right in front of your voice. There you go.
short of being an atheist, I'm understanding that there's, not for you, but previously, that there's two theories, and one is supreme being.
Be a rock star. Put it right here.
Supreme being, and one is supreme power. So does that make sense that those are short of being an atheist, and could you describe the difference between those two theories?
I think a supreme being is perhaps best understood by most people as God or an omnipotent power of some sort of a traditional. Many people in the United States, according to surveys on religion, consider themselves atheists, but then when you question them further, they actually believe in a higher power. Now, higher power doesn't necessarily mean God to those who use that phrase. It may mean some sort of very diffuse pantheism or panentheism idea that there is the force be with you. I mean, you know, it's sort of the equivalent of something like that. Some people don't accept the idea that there is a single deity, but they do believe that, you know, there's some sort of order in the universe that goes beyond that which the laws of nature could produce, and so they will attribute that to a higher power. But you'd probably be better off talking to someone who holds that belief, since I'm not sure that I'm doing justice to it. Mm-hmm. Well, and, you know, and the word atheist is, it's an interesting taxonomy. I showed you the continuum. If you go to the website and pull up the continuum lecture, or the cheat sheet for, you know, using as your background if you want to use this exercise in class. When you get down to the materialist part, there's a big subdivision of materialists, just like there's a subdivision of theists, because it's only fair. But there's sort of an interesting series of nomenclatural terms that go about among non-believers. They're all materialists in the sense that they believe only in a material universe, but some will describe themselves as agnostics. Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, is the one who coined the term agnostic, and his phrase was, "In this world you can never be completely sure." So you should sort of suspend belief. But everything else he did was as if there was no God. So there you have it. So there's agnostics, there are humanists, and there are atheists. Humanists, which is what I call myself, are people who don't believe in God, but they have an ethical system, a moral system. They are concerned with how to live a good life. It is a philosophy of life. Parallel to guidance for light that Christians or Muslims or Islams. It's just is not parallel to, not identical to. Okay, but it just as humanists will try to live well based on humanist values, just as a Christian will try to live well based on Christian values. So we have our own set. Atheists don't believe in God. That's kind of it. Atheism doesn't have a moral and ethical system, and it tends to be an anti-religious. Atheist means if you translate the Latin, means non-religious. But the context of atheist is anti-religious, at least in our country, which is why I don't call myself an atheist, because I'm not anti-religious. I'm non-religious. Actually, I find religion really interesting, but there you have it. So yeah, we have a taxonomy of materialists as well.
I was wondering if you know anything about blood types. And I was told that type O blood has the most ancient ancestry, and I was wondering if Europeans and Asians have more type O blood.
I think the issue of blood type is irrelevant to human history, because chimps and gorillas also have the ABO system. And I'd have to go back and look to see whether monkeys also have ABO, but I wouldn't be surprised. So this is sort of our stem of the anthropoid primates exhibit this system, and so it would not be relevant to distinguishing between groups of humans. It's like we all have a four-chambered heart because we're all mammals. You wouldn't use the characteristics of a four-chambered heart to distinguish between Asians and Europeans, because it's common to both. Similarly with the ABO blood group system.
I'd like to make a suggestion that should be in addition to that chart of yours. I do not agree, I can't speak for any cases, but I do not agree with the notion that an atheist has to be anti-religious.
Oh, good.
If I may use an analogy.
I'm just saying that's the connotation.
I'm a Jew. That means I am non-Christian, but I most definitely am not anti-Christian. And I think that's an important distinction that should be made. I think we should think adopting the term anti-theist to describe people who feel a need to attack religion, as opposed to simply saying they don't agree with the belief religion. And I'd add that in many ways this group adopts the same strategy, in my view, as the fundamentalists. They seem to think that casting doubt on religion somehow proves their point of view, just as the fundamentalists think casting doubt on evolution is proof of creationism. And I think the same fallacy is involved in doing this.
I take your comment and I thank you for it. When I said that atheist, let me clarify, because I was reflecting what I think is sort of a general attitude. When you say atheist, to most members of the general public, of course, the vast majority of the public is religious by their own description. When you say atheist, the connotation is anti-religious. I agree it would be much clearer. And if people who really were anti-religious would just call themselves anti-theists, that would be much tidier. But we play the deck we're dealt.
I always imagined I guess imagine that there's two sides on this teaching creation evolution issue, with the Discovery Institute and Maricopa's on one side and groups like NCSC on the other. And I was just wondering, a couple of things. Do people like Casey Ruskin and the Discovery Institute have more political clout They have a lot of political connections, but with the large number of, shall we say, Republicans in power. And I was just kind of wondering, what sort of counter influence do groups like UCSC have?
Okay, first off, good science education is not a Democrat versus Republican thing. Teaching evolution is not a Democratic and a Republican, Democrat Party, Republican Party thing. There's one circle, if you think in terms of Venn diagrams, of political conservatives. There's another circle of religious conservatives, and where they overlap is the religious right. It's that intersection where you have problems with the teaching of evolution. There are conservative Christians who don't reject evolution. Actually, one of the strongest arrows in our quiver are evangelical Christians who accept evolution, because they're going to be much more persuasive to their fellow religionists than somebody like me, because I haven't heard the good word. And the evangelicals who are also accepting of evolution have, so they're going to be much more persuasive. We have, there are plenty of Republicans who are members of NCSE, and they support good science education. So right now the country seems to be about equally, there's a continuum of political beliefs too, and there's the extremes, and most Americans are clustered around the middle somewhere, and they kind of shift back and forth depending on God knows what independents do. But I would hate to think that that we overly politicize this issue. There are Republican legislators that we reach out to when we want to stop a bill. They tend not to be the really conservatives. There's sort of intersection there because they're hopeless. But we have allies in both parties.
Hello?
There you are.
These are Don Chown, and I am mechanical, chemical, electrical organism with machine-like behavior.
You have to talk smack into the mic, otherwise be a rock star. Put it right here. All right, there you go.
And consider myself as this bizarre Zeldon Chown as a mechanical, chemical, electrical organism with machine-like behavior driven by my hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen DNA. Having said that, William James wrote in the Writings of Religious Experience in 1902, a religious experience brings a new zest for life, assures by safety, and a temper of peace, and in relation to others, the preponderance of loving affection ranging from mild institutions to wild hallucinations normally called insane. Would you comment on that?
No.
David Bracken, I'm an atheist, and the problem I have with this religion is what we've been talking about. Oh, I'm sorry. Religion's proposed, been talking about non-scientific, ideas which are typical. And I believe religion starts, and then the parents brainwash their children, and so that's how it's perpetuated. Also, religion is probably the single most common reason we have wars. There are other reasons, but that's probably the most common.
I just wanted to bring you another education viewpoint. Most people think this is a fight that's being fought in the science classroom. But we in the National Council for the Social Studies have a statement on intelligent design, because in places like Texas and Kansas, you've heard about the Kansas sticker that goes on the science book, there was an attempt to get a sticker on the world history book that said the same thing, for the reason that cave people, as described in Houghton Mifflin books, they date them to before the coexistence of the world. the National Council for the Social Studies statement I brought for you is very forceful, it's very powerful. It says there is indeed a place for teaching about intelligent design. In anthropology, you can teach it among other creation stories. In government classes, you can teach it as a set of cases before the Supreme Court. So the science teachers have very heartful allies in the social studies community.
I wonder whether we have that statement as part of our Voices for Evolution. I'd love to get that from you and make sure that we include that if we don't have it. When did you pass it? 06? 07. Yeah. Texas is a whole new bunch of problems. And Jefferson wasn't part of the Enlightenment. Texas is constantly entertaining.
So, you mentioned
I can actually see you.
Oh, hi. You mentioned earlier that there is no solid evidence against evolution, or evidence against common ancestry. Do you feel that the scientific community has a well-formed idea about what would constitute evidence against ancestry? I mean,
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Like a rabbit in the Precambrian would just shake the foundations of all of evolutionary theory?
The classic example. A rabbit in the Precambrian, or even in the Devonian. Hey, I'm flexible. We don't get rabbits until the Cretaceous at the very earliest, if you round way up, more likely the Eocene. No, the idea here is that if you get a major branch of the tree of life out of whack, something that shows up with, which is why the creationists love the idea of man tracks with dinosaur tracks, as they call them, man tracks. Human and dinosaur tracks found in the same strata. Yeah, that's tough for evolutionists to explain, all right. Too bad they never found any. No, not at all. Teach the controversy is a phrase that the Discovery Institute invented for evidence against evolution. When they say teach the controversy, they don't mean talk about the social controversy, which is real. Yeah, we're arguing about evolution. I have a job, that's why. That the society, some people don't want evolution taught, that's a controversy. That's not what they're talking about. They're saying that teachers should pretend to students that scientists are arguing over whether evolution happened. So teach the controversy is actually a directive to teachers to lie to students. I mean, I hate to be so blunt, but that's exactly what it is. If you go to one of the things that teachers can do, if a student comes up and says, oh, scientists are debating evolution, the first pillar of creationism there on my earlier discussion. If a student comes up and says, scientists are debating whether evolution happened, it's not real. The best way to deal with that is to, especially since you're right here and you've got universities close by, say, well, student, go over to the ASU library and just pick up a half a dozen or so Science magazine, Nature, Cell, any of the big, PNAS, pick up half a dozen or so of the science magazines and just look at the table of contents and look to see if any of the articles in those mainstream science journals are debating whether evolution took place. And if they do, bring it, come and tell me about it, because I'd be very interested. And of course, what happens mostly, the student's too lazy to go. But then he starts to believe you. If the student actually does go, and you could even, if you had a whole bunch of students like this, you could give them an assignment. If a student does go, they're going to flip through these journals, and they're going to find that nobody's debating whether evolution took place. But they've demonstrated it themselves. They're not taking, your authoritarian statement. They've actually proved it to themselves, which is a very powerful thing. But yeah, no, there's, you can disprove evolution, major part of the tree of life out of whack. How many geologists do you suppose are in the field when you consider the various extractive industries? You've got oil, you've got gas, you've got coal, you've got rare, diamonds, you've got gems, you've got all sorts of stuff, uranium. There's probably, I don't know, hundreds of geologists that are out there looking at rocks every single day, okay? Any of those geologists on any day, 365 days a year, any of those several hundred geologists looking at the geological strata would be able to could find those rabbits down in the Devonian or some other part of the tree of life totally out of whack. But they never do. Now that doesn't mean that someday somebody will come back and say, oh shit, what do we do now? But I don't think that's going to happen, okay? Sorry. We can bleep that out. I don't, but the fact that we've got all of these opportunities to show that evolution is wrong, I mean, that's, I think, a useful thing for people to understand. Probably 5,000 geologists on a worldwide basis or more, minimally 5,000 geologists, 365 days a year looking at rocks. None of them see evidence against evolution. That's good. That ought to give you some confidence that maybe this idea is here to stay.
Dr. Scott, thanks for coming and keep up the good work. We appreciate it. I'm a current volunteer on the science committee for Scottsdale, and rather than focusing on the negative, can you point to any districts or programs that have a really, really good science evolution program you look to as a model or aspects of that that we could use in our school districts? Anything like that, rather than focus on positive stuff.
Boy, that's a great question. We at NCSC, we tend to look more at state science standards. We don't usually, in a state, you'll have state standards, and then usually the districts will adopt the standards. You take the standards, and from the standards, then the district will develop a curriculum. In case those of you don't know the chain of command here. That's a little more retail than we actually go. I can't really help you with that. I know that California has good science standards in one sense, that they are very complete. They are also a little unteachable because there's too much detail. North Carolina has good standards, but one of the things that's going on that you all might be very interested in is there will soon, not as soon as scheduled, but within a year, there will be national science education standards that are real. There already are national science education standards that came out in 1994, but they're completely advisory. As it happened, they tended to be very influential in all the states in terms of the states developing their own standards. But this is this is different. Just like recently there were national standards in literature and national standards in math that were developed at the national level and then adopted by, I think, 48 states. Alaska and Texas declined. What can you say? But that's huge, that, that 48 states are using the same standards for math. This is wonderful. I'm not against local control of education. There's some very good things about local control of education. Curriculum, is not one of them, in the sense that there's no reason why a fourth grader in Iowa and a fourth grader in Arizona have a very different series of things they learn in math. This is dumb. A fourth grader is a fourth grader. So they're working now, the National Academy of Sciences and a commercial group, a business consulting firm called Achieve, are working on national science standards, which they will present for adoption. Now, I have reason to believe that the standards will be good. I haven't seen the latest, I haven't seen the draft. I've seen the national academies and commented on those. That's sort of the outline for what should be included, and that's very good. Then Achieve is going to take these standards and they will write the actual standards. Achieve will take the National Academy's blueprint and then write the standards from that. And then if the states adopt that, that will be very, very helpful for getting some sort of continuity of science education from state to state. And it'll also help the textbook publishers. They won't have to put out a Texas edition, right? They may, but only Texas is going to get it, if that's the case, because all the other states can have the standard science, which would be great. So keep an eye out for the national science standards. If you're a member of NCSC, we'll be notifying you about this. You know, proof is in the pudding. We'll see what they look like. If we like them, we will encourage people around the country to get behind it and try to push their state into adopting them. But I'm sorry I can't help you with the kind of positive example at the district level.
Eugenie, thanks for being here tonight. Matt Cholney, Secular Coalition for Arizona. I have a vested interest in the legislative process and how these bills go through the legislature. You have your list up there with regards to different bills that have been showed up in different states in different years.
For academic freedom.
Correct. Can you
Types.
tell me, do you know from your experience if those bills had lost in the committee process, or had any of them made it to the floor for vote and then shot down at that spot?
I'm pretty sure that all of them got zapped in committee. They got tabled. When they get to the floor, they're very hard to stop.
Correct.
And that's why we're so worried about Tennessee.
That's what we like to say, is that
Yeah.
it has to be killed in committee, otherwise once it makes it to the open floor, politics take precedence, and folks that may want to vote against it are forced to vote for it or against what we would like them to vote. So.
Yeah, we had that problem in Louisiana, unfortunately. There were Democrats and Republicans that wanted to vote against it, but you know, it was going to pass, and so there you have it. So, yeah, it's the legislative process is, but you know, once more, it's those personal relationships. We have a member in Oklahoma who has stopped a lot of bills because he knows the chair of the requisite committees, and he can tell them exactly why this bill is bad for students, you know, bad for education. And